So thank you, Elise, and your assistants for the great hospitality. This is my first time to Sweden. I find it a blessing to be here. I'm really enthusiastic to be among interdisciplinary group of scholars who are thinking about informal banks. This is a project that I had to save until after getting tenure to really explore, because if I could do it again, this would have probably been my first project. So this work is about 11 years in the making of doing research and interviews. So don't be stunned at the hundreds of people that you hear. Just know that it's been happening for at least 8 years of just constantly talking to these banker ladies. I am at York University, a pretty large university of 50,000 students. I am in one of the largest programs called Business and Society, housed in the Social Science Department. Yes, so thank you. This talk, as Elise mentioned, is coming out of 2 funded projects by the Canadian government, both at the federal and the provincial level, trying to understand how we think about what we call our third sector, is the social economy, solidarity economy for some of you. How do we make it more racially inclusive? Because right now, both the research and those who head those types of institutions lack in cultural diversity. So I'm really exploring the ideas of anything sort of quote unquote alternative. For me, it's community economies. They've always been around. We just haven't been seeing them. So the talk that I'll be doing is most vested there. I like the topic of today, of this workshop, informal markets, now and then, and I'm working on these banker ladies in a very empirical way. I go out and do interviews, which you'll see, thinking through their lived experiences of how they engage with markets, but how do they embed markets in their communities, in their social lives that they live every day. Let me just say that, yeah. So I am trained as an academic from a very strict discipline of political science, and I am extremely undisciplined in that discipline, in that I could never find a work as a political scientist, because their concept of how we strive for truth and objectivity can't be relating to our subjects or understanding about the ethics of the work that we do. So as a feminist, Black feminist researcher, I will out my positionality, because so much of the work that I do on the social economy, particularly looking at informal bank, comes from some sort of lived experiences and the influences that I have acquired over the years. And as Elise said, you know, I come from a history of people who have been moving, right? Ancestors who hail from parts of West Africa, one part of my genealogy, settles in the Caribbean, and then eventually migrates to parts of North America, be it the US or Canada. And in those movements of people moving, they've always moved their money systems, these localized, collective, cooperative systems. And I've seen that growing up. It's just been a part of the type of many financial devices that people use to cope as a minority in this part of the world. So much so that has influenced, that's why I worked for such a long time in community economic development, better part of a decade, looking from mostly placed within Black organizations, providing, or as we called it, co-opting financial resources to assist in the self-help movement of people of African descent. And so my research pretty much is focused on those same people, the African diaspora, to understand how we're more inclusive. So what am I going to talk about today, now that I've outed my own personal politics in the ways that I approach this research? I'm going to talk about what we call the social economy, but I'm going to inject this concept, which is a grounded theory that's in work. It's in a working stage, so because I'm among friends still thinking this concept, or what I'm calling a body of epistemologies, as the Black social economy. And then I'm going to move into, and I'll try not to delay, but there is this interesting part of theorizing when you're looking at minority groups engaged in informal banks. What kinds of theories should we be thinking as we unpack their experiences? And I'm going to do so with findings from my own work on these banker ladies. But first, let me talk about Canada the Good a bit, because I like to anchor my story from where I come from right now, situated in the Americas. About 5 years ago, a Black Canadian man walks into a very cosmopolitan part of Toronto City. Parts of it is not, but in this east end of the city, to make a deposit for a check, that a realtor wrote. He was apprehended. There was suspicion that it could be fraudulent. He was arrested, and the bank eventually apologizes for this gross error of humiliating someone trying to do a banking deposit. Every now and again you get these stories, not often, but when they come, they're quite gruesome. 2 weeks ago, a grandfather, an Indigenous grandfather, there by the name of Maxwell Johnson, which is supposed to be a happy occasion, walks into a bank in Vancouver, another major city in Toronto, very diverse, to open up a bank account for his granddaughter, the first time ever. We all remember that experience. It's supposed to be a joyous moment. IDs seem suspicious to the teller, calls the police on site. They arrest the elderly man and this 12-year-old kid. Bank has apologized for the atrocity and the inconvenience, but that's humiliation, everyday humiliation of people of color who just want to do a mundane task, making a bank deposit or opening up a bank. And so it's not that surprising in this part of the Americas that people would turn to alternatives or thinking about different ways of banking, perhaps. And so we, in that part of the world, in the Americas, and when I say that, I'm thinking about the Caribbean, the US, and Canada, we look at this sector, this third sector, they call it in Europe, or I'm going to use the term social economy. We have arrived on this concept of the social economy, this third sector where people of color seek refuge. It's a larger study. I'm a professor of social economy. That's what I do. I talk about these alternatives. And so we're looking at institutions that are concerned about both economic and social objectives, and how can you do both and live well or live sustainably, right? And a part of that work that I'm doing, I'm interested in, well, where do people of color hibernate or congregate in this large sector called the social economy, because we know they go there when big business or government can be hostile. And so I found the social economy ROSCAs, which we're calling informal banks for this workshop, but ROSCAs, informal banks, money pools, these mutual aid groups, the many vernaculars that people use because of their own cultural identity are places where people tend to go to find financing, okay? And when I look at the mapping of what this solidarity social economy looks like, there's a lot of interaction between the state and business. But there's a segment of the social economy that is untouched by government or business, and it's on purpose, because when groups have been made to feel excluded for various reasons in society and in business, they will turn inwards to organize and pool resources to get the projects they're done. The issue is that ROSCAs, it's not the question of whether ROSCAs belong a part of the social economy. It's just that they're muted out often in the conversation in academic literature because of their informal status. And so when we think about Roscas and the role that they play, I've started realizing they're so undermined in the research. And that's exactly the place that we should be looking at when you want to think about, well, why are many minorities engaged in this form of organizing, informally particularly, because it's a lifeline for them to exist. And so what I've started realizing is that, well, we're not telling narratives and we're not reaching the kinds of theories and ideas that help to explain what the larger social economy picture is. We often describe them as users or recipients of this aid of the social economy, but never as the protagonists, the people that organize and contribute and develop civic society and mutual aid. And part of it is and I mean, we all come from different cultural contexts, but in the Americas, we forget the story of the Underground Railroad. We often tell it as this sort of abstract thing for Black History Month, but without realizing the relevance it had in cooperation. Groups of people coming together under much adversity, both Black and white, who didn't believe in an inhumane system of slavery, right? So people pooled resources and moved bodies across or northward. Where we get stuck on is things like the Caisse Populaire movement that came to the Americas and trickled down from Canada. You know, a French minority group, Catholic, piloted this idea of the Caisse Populaire because it was a way for them to access financial resources in a sea of Anglican Protestants. And at the time, at the turn of the 1900s, that's what it was. And so this Desjardins movement, precisely what it was, has led this major solidarity movement, but that is often the starting point of how we talk about inclusion in the social economy. And then the story goes on with fisher folks in Eastern Canada who politicize the discussion to stand up against individualized commercialization. All very credible and relevant to the fabric of Canadian social economy or the social economy in the Americas. But what we miss out are these individualized experiences, collective experiences of what are racialized people, Aboriginal people doing. I take Viola Desmond for you today. She's quite famous in Canada. She appears as the only person of color on one of our money bills, our $10 bill. She was a woman who was an activist, business person, who today would be categorized as a social entrepreneur. She organized vocational technical training for other minority Black women to access beauty services and for themselves to be trained to eventually become self-reliant and have their own businesses. She was abused for standing up against entering a certain cinema house and sitting in a certain place. She had her own means and realized that it wasn't fair. She was a paying customer and had a right to sit where she needed to. It's our first Rosa Parks. She actually predates Rosa Parks. But many people don't realize that stand of resistance, though quietly, was coming from somewhere to really upset the way that business is normally done. And that's precisely when I say I'm playing with this idea. So forgive me a little bit. I'm working still through on this manuscript of the Black Banker Ladies, but what we're doing is working on this collectively with a number of people, this concept of the Black social economy. How do you inject this idea of lived experience and politicized action collectively to really transform the way that business is ordinarily done? And part of what I do is I reach out to historians, and I'm glad to be in a house here with a number of historians, because as an empirical social scientist, we're always obsessed on collecting data and what is so-and-so saying in our interviews and what have you. But what I'm doing also is drawing on stories that historians have seen in the region that validates how long people have been engaged in these kind of money pooling systems and the kinds of risk and danger that people had to take on individually and collectively so that they could buy their freedom, for example. So if you think about it, the slaves who came from the Gold Coast traveled this treacherous journey, arrived various places in the Americas, brought their music and food and ideas of dance while in bondage, but they also brought money systems. And so historians like at Morgan State, like Maurice St. Pierre, will talk about the buying clubs in Guyana. And it was actually buying clubs meant people would pool resources when they had their first one day free on Sundays as a way to earn a little bit of money, because they had this hope that one day they could probably buy their freedoms. And so these kinds of stories that historians have been writing about for decades is all of a sudden relevant when I talk about contemporary banker ladies, because these banker ladies, often in centers where there's lots of financial devices, still deliberately, purposefully also organize these collective banking systems. And they go by all kinds of names. And what they're actually doing, and so my question when I'm doing my research is, why do these banker ladies have such high demand in the Americas, from the Caribbean countries into a place where I live, where there's a number of the diaspora who've been coming since the 1940s in droves? Why is this so relevant? Why are first and second generations still engaging in this, even third? And why are these money pooling systems, ROSCAs, absent when we talk about the mapping of what the social economy means and mutual aid in the third sector? And so when we look at the banker ladies in this way of, and these are the women who organize these ROSCAs in informal banks, ultimately, but yet quietly, what they're doing is really protesting against individualized, commercialized forms of banking and providing some kind of alternative. And in order for me to explain and do all of this, I needed theorizing that could explain the ideas of the hundreds of people I spoke to. And so drawing, and this is what I always ask scholars when I'm in a room of diverse groups, is that let us try to make our scholarship more diverse, right? Thinking through who are those people who are speaking, who actually could have some lived experience, who understand the trials and the behavior of the very people we're trying to assess. So this is part of why my work is somewhat controversial in parts of where I live, is because I'm emphatic in drawing on the plethora of literature that exists by Black economists and social economists who are thinking about things like group economics, right? Who are feminist economists who in the 1970s came together on a Combahee River collective, and they said, we are going to stand for a set of principles that are concerned about our economic livelihoods. The banker ladies, this idea that it is just a social gathering is not the complete picture of what banker ladies are doing, at least in this part of the region. It's about self-help on your own terms. It's about creating an intentional community of people who are trying to, yes, to better their own livelihoods, but also those who they live with together, understanding the struggles and the historical oppression they endure as a group of people. And so you can now see, when I show you the slides, just, oh, look at such a typical social scientist, right? We're obsessed with just talking to people a lot. And this is why this work is very labor-intensive work, because you're traveling to all these countries and then you sit down and you speak to banker ladies. And you know, these numbers are much larger in some ways. I had to stop at some point because lots of these banker ladies that I spoke to can represent at least 8 to 70 people, depending on how big their banking group is. So the numbers, the discussions with 400, close to 400, you can multiply that by a factor of 5 or 10, whatever you feel comfortable with. But I feel like, and I wanted to just isolate the Canadian experience. It's a much smaller sample size, Jamaica being my largest sample size, to give you an idea of the kinds of voices that are speaking to me in these findings that I'm going to share with you now, because I think this is the exciting part of what I do, is listening. So I'm going to just cherry pick I have a book coming, hopefully, I'm in the process of revisions, but I'm going to choose 5. I've chosen 5 that I think are interesting, that might fit with some of the work that many of the people here are doing or could be of interest. But it's also findings that resonates across the 5 different countries and Canada to some extent. And understanding that these are very different locales, Global South, Global North, what have you. But and also recognizing that within Canada, not just Caribbean, people of Caribbean descent, but also Africans of various different countries, and those who are Black Canadians who have been here for generations. And so one important finding has been that mutual aid groups for these women, who are sometimes the most exploited people in society, whether they're in Jamaica or whether they're in Guyana, feeling racially excluded, have seen ROSCAs as a form of support. It's a system where you can find camaraderie in people who understand your life experience. It's a way for the women, though a lot of extra work on them, because a lot of them do this voluntary, is to uplift the communities that they come from. So they're doing their own individual projects or perhaps a group project. But for some of them who migrate, it's also a way of adjusting too, right? You come to a certain community, you might find yourself in a community of people who come from the same country or the region. So it's a way, if you're unemployed, to start a sideline gig or to work in a lower paid job and then to have some sort of entrepreneurial activity on the sideline. I'll show at the end a film that it's been like 3 years in the making. It's just like this nightmare film, but I will definitely, I'll show you a little clip that we have for now, but hopefully it'll be out later this year. A part of the accountability and people being more connected, in interviewing Canadian women, I want to see what the role technology played or access to online and what have you. In the Caribbean, it was almost zero. And a lot of that because people preferred going into the branch offices if they had to. And some people who just didn't bank at all, or there was microfinance, sort of alternative community-based financial programs or credit unions that were in their community. But in the Canadian setting, I wanted to know, because we've become so automated. I just was curious, how are people engaging? And what I did learn is that women, the banker ladies, almost 100 that I spoke to, prefer person-to-person banking. So they wait in the queues to go into the banks. But there has been, when I first started interviewing Canadian banker ladies, the numbers weren't as high. Now they are. There are a lot more people participating. They won't do online, as you can see. That's still sort of online, less than about a third are engaging in that. The vast majority will go to ATMs with the help of their children who are schooled and educated in this part of the world. And a lot of this modernization of banking is also something that compels people, believe it or not, in cities like Toronto to engage in these peer-to-peer ROSCA informal banks, because it's a sense of it's a part of socializing. It's something that's familiar and easy to access, particularly if you work long hourly, you work 12-hour days, right? It's also this idea of, what was I saying, familiarity. So a part of this accountability and this appreciation that people have for commercial banks, it's also this idea, je connais les caisses les seules avant que je suis née. This is what Haitians tell you constantly. And if to be Caribbean, I have known about ROSCAs or informal banks, they call it SOL, before I was born. I get it, automatically I get it. And what they're saying is that, this is second nature. This is something ancestral. People before me have been doing this for such a long time. It's like plaiting your hair or something. It's such a common feature in life, right? And that trust is so embedded into these systems, which is what makes it special. And I think that was something, a finding that I found no matter which border I was in. Is it Jamaica? It's Toronto. I had to wake myself up because so many of these responses were quite similar. Here's something very distinct to parts of the Americas that were, let's just say, complex. Whether we have rogue states, politicized elites, we call them big man politic in the Caribbean. So these clientelistic arrangements that can make it very difficult for people to engage with markets. Rosca's informal banks, Guyanese will call it a box hand. Jamaicans call it a patna, Trinidadian susu. They see these systems as a way to restore their own dignity, right? Again, building the sense of support when you are so alienated from ordinary banking systems because of the elites in your country. You don't want to be part of their capture, so you engage and create your own systems that are so underground often that they cannot reach, right? And it builds a kind of a political consciousness. It's what they call people call it an opt-out card out of these big man politics, okay? And so each country had their own sort of clientelistic, exclusionary forms of banking or business, but these informal banks were prided on, were trusted because they were free from elite manipulation. Another finding that I found across these cases was this idea that what they were doing was a counter movement. And I'm plugging this film here. It's I think it's about a 50-minute film, and it was done by a Haitian American anthropologist at Wesleyan University. I think that's in Connecticut. Gina Ulysses and her other colleagues, who I'm failing on their names, but they had this film called Potomitan. And it's just spectacular in terms of looking at the hardship that Haitian women go through. And what saves them is this idea of soul. And this, again, it's an informal bank that they turn to. They will take themselves out of these menial sort of sweatshop factories. And even though they're not living these fancy rich lives by participating in informal banks, what they do have is choice and freedom of how they spend their time, and they get involved in advocacy and what have you, because they're building up these networks with other like-minded people. And Haiti, often this country seen as, perpetual stress, either natural or man-made disasters, people think it's a country devoid of democracy or cooperation, right? It just seems like constant political chaos. There's a famous political scientist by the name of Robert Fatton, and I think it's at Virginia Tech, studies authoritarianism. And he says Haiti is full of democracy. It's full of economic cooperation. You just have to go to the local arenas to see that, because people are participating in combat, groupement, and soul constantly, every day, because it keeps them free again of the politics by elites at the higher national stage. And this idea of counter movements continues. I traveled to Grenada. Mummy, a spice trader. Read her quote, because I think it makes lots of sense. And so for her, you almost have to read it in a patois, right? Like, susu is the thing. You can get your money when you want it and nobody give you a problem. You can say to the susu banker, give me a hand. And she can, because she know what she can do. We bind. No one can change this. This is idea of solidarity economics, countering this push for constant commercialization, that they'll be like, yeah, we'll participate in your formal banking systems, but we also have knowledge and expertise in ours too. However, the story of countering and being sort of a counter movement is very much prevalent in the Canadian context too. And people often that's the surprising element of what I'm doing, because they're like, what, Canada? You have Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau, right? There's a stigma when we talk about these informal banks. The banker ladies in the Canadian environment will hide the systems they do because they're so misunderstood. They're actually stigmatized for the work that they're doing, not recognized. And a lot of it might be because there's no knowledge on what these institutions are, though we have a legacy of mutual aid. Often these kinds of informal banks are seen as pyramid schemes or some sort of corrupt, illegal drug or weapon trafficking networks, right? As opposed to these really thoughtful, organized money systems to deal with exclusion and racism in our banking system. And when you ask banker ladies directly, do you see yourself as a form of resistance? People are like, they're never going to tell you this. Yeah, overwhelmingly, over 80% of them say, yeah, we totally are. We hide them. We hide them. Don't use our names. We hide them because we're afraid they're going to come after us. But we are totally resisting this concept of, individual marketplaces when we also have our own devices that make sense collectively. So there's the fourth, almost getting there, this idea of a time, these systems are honorable, that these systems are indigenous. They're homegrown systems that matter to people who use them. Banker ladies will say that this is so trusted. I know the people that I'm banking with. I actually care about them. I care about the work that I'm doing, but I also want to see how I can extend self-help and benefit others in my community. So by the users who participate, whether we're in Canada or whether we're in various parts of the Caribbean, this is understood. Valuable, important. There's a legacy. There's a tradition, right? They're not foregoing on other commercial devices. No, they get their salaries in them. Some will use them equally. Some use banking systems minimally just to get a salary, but most of their transactions occur in this informal way. People love it. Really? That's happening in Montreal and Toronto? Yep, It is happening. It's this trust mechanism that's happening for certain segments of our society. But here's the divergence. In the Caribbean, people who work in the banking systems, those commercial bankers, understand the value and the affinity that ordinary people have to these informal banks, that in the commercial banks they work with, they mimic them. They create their own product lines called the partner plan in a commercial bank. In Haiti, you'll go into another very elitist bank that services only 1% of the population, the fancy ones in Pétionville. But they say we will also have the Mama Soul because we're trying to attract this new market. The banker ladies say, these systems are nothing like the ones we have. But you can see that they can appreciate because they themselves may have experienced their mamas using these systems. Whereas in the Canadian system, there's no such thing. It's not even recognized as anything good. And so that leaves me, I can't only just, kind of critical social scientist will I do, if I don't also have focus groups that talk about the trauma that people have endured in participating in informal banks, because there's a long list that exceeds the one that I have here. And I actually organize focus groups to speak to people across the region and in Canada. What are the horror stories? That's how it was advertised. What are the horror stories you have had with these informal banks? I love it that you come out to my focus groups in droves and tell me about why you appreciate them. Now I'm going to have a session for people who have been failed by them. And they did. They came out. And they told me all kinds of things. But these are the top ones that kept coming up. There is a kind of there is a serious consequence if people abscond or don't participate correctly in these systems that the group will undertake. And they're quite frightening, actually. You can be ice-picked. You can have acid thrown at you. You could be beaten up so badly you can't move for days. You could die, depending on what the group is determining. But there's things like fraud and, people get, you lose money either internally or externally. People get ostracized so that they have no friends in a community that they need friends. And then just sort of the issues that happen with remembering things when nothing is, sometimes they're not written down. And I'm not saying all these risks happen for everyone, but it's good for us to think about informal banks and think about, well, what are the downsides to having these systems? And I think that that's a part of these systems being cherished and valued, is that the women who participate in them understand that there's these dark sides. And even in those focus groups that I target people who've had negative experiences, then I always ask, well, how many of you belong to any of them? And thinking that the room would go silent, the majority of people raise their hands. I'm like, oh God, you've just been traumatized by these systems. You tell me the most provocative, scariest stories of how you've lost money, and they laugh. Yeah, we still use them. We just have to find a better banker lady. You see? I mean, there is this kind of, I don't know whether it's cultural, it's something that's familiar. There is this, even though they have lost so much, it seems like, is it that there's no other place to go? Or is it that they really do value this kind of social mechanism that these systems offer? And finally, the finding that I found that I'm working on right now, and I'm going through the data, is this idea that is so globalized. The concept of banker ladies. I remember sitting in Coronation Market in Kingston, Jamaica, and the lady was just rattling off all her membership, and about a third of them came from outside of Jamaica. So there were Jamaica diaspora in Miami, in parts of Toronto that I knew, London. And so these systems, and they never traveled to these places. She's just managing her money pool from this, city of Kingston in Jamaica. But having members who were traveling back and forth, and it was a sense of connectedness. So when they came home on vacation, hopefully they'd get their hand of money and then they could do whatever they had to do while they were there. But this idea of money pooling, as historians in the house will know, is a very ancient, long-standing tradition globally, right? Parts of India and Ghana today have legislation, right? And they have had it for decades of how to regulate and how to recognize either chit funds or susu systems. But people are moving, right? And as they move, and there's a foundational book by Ardner and Berman in 1996 who writes about these money-go-rounds. And they say that, as people move around the diaspora, they bring these systems with them. So they're adding this kind of value to Western societies, and I like to think that they're addressing issues of financial access for certain groups of people. And Fardosa, the Somali-born Canadian, speaks to that kind of innovation that they feel they bring when they move to places like Toronto. So the system of Hagbad is an informal bank. It's a collective by Somali women who organize it. A young Somali woman sees it as being, might be strange to outsiders, but to an observing Muslim who can't participate in financial systems that have interest rate. Well, how do you then buy homes and send your kids to school? You collectively organize to make that possible. The Canadian banking system hasn't figured out how to do Islamic banking, but there are millions of people who are trying to figure out, well, we're going to get this done while policymakers wonder how to do it. And so they organize these kitchen tables, and it's a great festive event to go to a Hagbad party. You get fish samosas, and you eat food, people play music, and then the women are like, okay, we're getting down to business now, because they have their businesses and projects to get on with. fantastic. But this to me as a student of the Canadian social economy reminds me of my school days in Nova Scotia when we studied the anti-Ganesh movement of the fisher folk who were collectively organizing around kitchen tables to talk about this absurd infringement of their rights through extreme forms of commercialization or industrialization of the fishing industry. It's the same kind of kitchen tables that these women are doing. And so this whole debate of, do you formalize, do you not formalize? I was running down that rabbit hole with banker ladies, and I decided that I would bring an expert from the Global South who have actually done formalization in Ghana. After many visa tries, we finally got him through, because the concept of having someone and an expert on Susu come to Canada to instruct us how to do banking more humanely was just seen as the most bizarre thing. Why would this professor do this? And so he came and spoke to the banker ladies. A huge showing showed up for a conversation on formalization or not. And it was very divided, to say the least, because formalization may work in some contexts like they do in Ghana. They haven't managed to do it throughout the society. There are still unregulated forms of Susu. But in the Canadian environment, a much different cultural context, there are those who believe that, formalizing might offer us some protection as consumers, so that when officers come to buildings to do drug raids, that they don't confiscate our money that is legitimate because it's for Ayutu or Hagbad or Susu and mix it up with drug money, because they're completely different. But if they're not sensitized to knowing that informal banks are actually very operating in this context, then we lose that. So they understand the interest of formalization. But there is this subsect, I call them these radical banker ladies, who are like, oh no, no one is going to formalize these systems, because that's when you take away our power. So much of our daily lives are being regulated. We are oppressed every day. And now a government who mistreats us, or the private sector who doesn't respect us, now want to be involved in something that we have trusted for centuries. They won't come around so easily. But it speaks to this sort of transnational ideas are coming into a city like Toronto, and people are having these fulsome discussions of whether to formalize or not to formalize. So I want to conclude that what I hope I've shared with you today on another region of the world, like the Americas, where I am a child of the Americas, is that these informal banking systems, very much a part of the past, is also something that is a living economic that's with us here in today's society. And I don't fear that these things are going to become redundant. They haven't with more modernity. In fact, I actually believe that they will continually grow, because what I'm finding is that non-ethnic Canadians, white Canadians, Canadians come from different groups, young people are joining and participating in these systems because they provide a different way of doing business, more collectively, more socially, more engaged with your neighbors and the people you know. And how do we do so? How do we do so asking questions about trust? And how can we build trust using money cooperatively as a vehicle to do so? And so I'd like to thank you for listening to me for this keynote on the Black Banker Ladies. I am a part of a network or a collective called DICE, which is Diverse Solidarity Economies. And I'll probably be coming around talking to a number of you, because I would love to hear your ideas about ways to support and work with this collective. So I thank you again.
Thank you so much. That was very exciting. We can take a few questions,
Sure.
because we have a bit of time.
Okay, good.
So perhaps take a few questions and then we can show the trailer of your coming
Yes.
documentary.
That's wonderful.
Is there any questions? Jacob.
Thank you very much. I already explained to you that I'm not only a historian, but I deal with, well, times far, far away in the past. So this is a bit difficult for me to wrap my mind around, except for when I go to my own life. I deal with a faceless bank, a big Swedish banking institution, and it does have its downsides, obviously. But when I look at my own personal situation, I live in a neighborhood where everyone makes use of these faceless banks. And the way I see it, one of the effects is that there is no credit relations in my community. And I'm just wondering whether you could explain from your experience to what extent this is something that, and I picked this up listening to you, on the one hand might reduce opportunities for community building, which I could see happening because I have hardly any dealings with my neighbors. But on the other hand, also protects me in my social life from engaging in unequal relationships.
Right.
And I was a bit surprised that, I mean, you were very, very honest with showing the dark side to informal banks, but this inequality, credit relations, elevating one person above the other, I was a bit surprised that this did not emerge in your overview. No one indicated that this was the result of personal credit relations, because as a historian I would expect that to happen. With the commercial banks in Canada, right? Is that what you're asking me? Whether they find exclusion or... No, more with the informal banks.
Yeah. Oh, the banks they organize. Yeah. Whether there are issues with... No, because the groups I'm working with, many of them share a similar socioeconomic class background or cultural background. Not always, and I'm using that hesitantly because these dynamics are changing. So you'll find, particularly in the Canadian environment I'm speaking to, they're becoming intercultural. So you'll find Somalis work with Haitians or, Ghanaians or what have you. In the Caribbean context, they belong to often a similar locale, like a socioeconomic grouping. In fact, that's pretty clear. So even if they're lower class people participating in this, or middle class, it tends to be people from the same socioeconomic grouping that participate in these informal systems. The issues of the downside doesn't happen in terms of any kind of bias among identities. So identity politics doesn't come into play within the informal banks, because oftentimes the reason why they choose these informal banks is because of what's happening on the outside. So in mainstream banking systems or professionalized microfinance systems, there are inequities that are occurring, but they don't feel comfortable in participating in those. So what these groups do is self-select members that they know and trust so that they don't have to engage in those kinds of social inequalities that you're pointing to. Though there are other downsides of favoritism that might come into play, or delays in accessing the resources they need. And this is harmful if you're a seasonal worker and you need money at a certain time. It can affect the kinds of work you do. So they have other issues that come up, but identity politics doesn't rear its head in these kinds of groups like it does in more mainstream banks that we have. It's probably the reason why a number of these groups also create, I hate using the term, for lack of a better term, these alternative forms of banking systems.
I will do something that I'm not allowed to do very often in Sweden. I will abuse my position of power and ask a question.
Okay.
As a historian, you know, and as a historian of credit relation, this is very much what I've observed about peasants in the 17th and 18th century in France. And I have a question. You haven't mentioned at all gender. As, you know, those people, the socialization aspect is very important, and trusting each other, being with each other, doing things with each other is very important. And I was wondering if the fact that they do that with other women can be something that, you know, perhaps is binding, or something that is challenging, or I have perhaps a guess that, you know, it's something they do without men for one reason. And I don't know what you think about it.
That's you know, I guess I thought that just the very notion of this topic, the banker ladies, they're exclusively female. Once in a while you have men involved, often in a sort of a professional capacity. So say a group wants to have bookkeeping done, and this is particularly true in parts of the islands. They may have one man there with a specific role to play, the bookkeeping or doing the numbers or something like that, if the women cannot do this. But generally these groups are exclusively female, and you're right, when they have these, there's a section that I talk about the accountability or the socializing aspect is very relevant, and it's much more comfortable when a group of women can come together, usually around food, and talk. They gossip, they talk politics, they think of ways if they're having marital issues. This forum depends on the group dynamic, right? Can be very social. It's considered a safe space for women, and particularly for women who also can feel the side effects of being not just female, but what does it mean to be black and female and from a certain class grouping, underprivileged, in an environment that can stigmatize them. So it's this intersectional approach that these women are experiencing as black, female, and of a certain class grouping that binds them in a space that they could, I guess, feel like there's a sense of belonging, and within these communities in the Caribbean, but also to when they move, right? Like, so say they move to a place like Montreal, where the English may not be their first language, or French may not be their first language. It's Arabic, or it's, you know, just a different, it could be Spanish. They at least have this grouping of women culturally who they can identify as a form of support. And so it's that idea of accountability for people who they feel safe with. Sort of that idea of uplifting themselves, but in a very safe space. But thank you. There's a very strong gender. It's almost like, where are the men when we're talking about the banker ladies? But it's not to say, you raise a good question. There are men groups too partaking in these societies. I'm just focused on black women.
I have more questions about that. I will let other people ask questions as well. Yanni.
So I have a question that goes to your slide about the dark sides of these groupings, and in a way, you know, everything that you listed on the slide, in a certain sense, seems to be kind of, you know, they're dark sides, but they're in a way internal to these groups in the sense that they're basically part of the design. Right? So it's a kind of like, you know, if you think about, you know, how you organize something like that, you know, you would expect that, you know, that list would arise. So in a way, if you sign up to the group, you kind of are signing up to the dark sides. And I'm just wondering whether there is a way to think about the dark sides from an external perspective, where you're sort of thinking about, you know, how you compare as a potential client this form of banking to other forms of banking that, you know, or finance that might be available to you. And what kind of intrigued me was when you said that, you know, some of these people who were in the focus groups who were talking about the sort of the bad stuff, they said, well, maybe I can go to a better, you know, banking lady. So I still want to stick with this mode, but go to a better. And I guess I was just trying to think about the way in which one would think to compare, basically, sort of, you know, different groups, or to compare this with other forms of financing.
Yeah, so this idea is, I mean, it addresses this issue of compliance, right? Like that's what we're speaking about when a lot of this, the downsides, often, not all of them, some of them has to just do with human error when it's not as written down, say. And I should qualify to say that some of the consequences that you saw that I listed seem very dramatic and extreme, but it's also that they don't happen with frequency. Defaulting or absconding, but people are aware of a consequence that could happen. So it's almost mythical in some ways, because it doesn't actually, I can really count on one hand over the 11 years of really intense forms of penalties or action taken, so that people are aware of what happens. But everyone has a story that they have witnessed of someone absconding and that knew that so-and-so got ice picked or had acid thrown in their face. And this could be like decades old, but that memory or that understanding still lives with them, that they are aware that there can be extreme consequences when people don't comply. So I just want to say that this happens rarely, but it's important for us to know that it does occur, and it will depend on the group structure. So every group has its own executive, and they determine, because there's consensus building about how we deal with this group. You know, some groups have told me they do something as little as we tolerate the person for as long as we can, and then eventually we'll never let them join again, right? Like we will tolerate them almost, and then eventually they get blacklisted ultimately or ostracized from participating in these systems, because word of mouth will go quite quickly. So people know inherently what's going on. I don't know, that's a good question. Are there the social consequences of not performing in these systems? I don't know of any other system, and I have worked in microfinance, that mete out the same kinds of intense results for non-complying. Though, I mean, you could have a bad credit history, which would haunt you for the time that you're located where you are. But I don't think these women know what the consequences are at various financial institutions. So they know that it's more severe to default on these kind of informal banking systems, because the personal cost is so much greater than any other financial institution that I can think of, depending on how you want to measure what is more extreme. But your point about, well, how do they search for, even though they've been victim or traumatized by an experience, what do they mean by looking for another more equipped or what they call it is a better enforcer, it sounds crazy, or a better champion, someone who can really manage and regulate membership. And so if they find there is someone who's ready to punish people, who's considered a recognized leader, those are often the people they'll turn to. And that's why I said in Canada, there's a cross-fertilization of groups happening, which didn't happen when I first started this project. Jamaicans deal with Jamaicans, Trinidadians go to Trinidadians, the Sierra Leoneans deal with their own group. Everyone had their own little enclaves. But what you witness now, and as you get deeper into these groups, what you find is that certain groups will say, no, that lady I don't care that we share the same nationality. She's a loser when it comes to making everyone pay their dues on a timely way. And I have a business to run, or I have this, right? And so they will move out of group dynamic, and they will say, move to that Jamaican. I pay her a small fee, and she makes sure everyone is strict and disciplined with the time that we need these resources in. And that's kind of what they mean. So I think they take the onus as they blame themselves for choosing a group that didn't have their mechanisms in place and was poorly managed. You see? And it almost becomes a personal cost. And that's what they do. So really, being a banker lady, it's some kind of pressure to make sure you have the right one. But no, I don't think that there's any equivalent banking system that has the same kind of, can we say, retribution or consequence for lack of compliance that I've seen in these systems. That's why I find them so fascinating. And it's not like they're hidden, right? From the time you sign up, you know, this is the deal. And I'm like, you knew that going in, that you could be ice picked? Yes. I mean, this is understood. But the plan is that this is never going to happen because we're all committed to a cause. We're part of a group, we're in a project, this is how we cooperate and work together. And they choose you carefully. There are people who've been like totally rejected because they don't qualify. It's very interesting to see untrained people who are not educated in banking determine the qualifications of who makes membership. That's another piece of work.
Ding.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about your interesting work. And I had a question about what you call the globalized transnational dimension of these groups. Now you mentioned that oftentimes people are part of Roskas that are active in different countries. They are part of Roskas here in Canada perhaps, and also in the Caribbean, and they sort of pool and redistribute the resources this way. Has there been, or to what extent do you see these groups also as operating as collective mediators of resources? For example, when working or observing the work of some diaspora organizations in the New England area of the US, I oftentimes hear that we want to do more than just send back individual remittances or participate in groups here and there. We want to send back resources collectively. We want to help communities in Africa or elsewhere in our countries of origin. But there are a lot of formal hurdles and limitations to that sort of activity.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you also mentioned here about difficulties of formalization of those groups. To what extent these groups have those aspirations, and do you see them as being successful to some extent in those collective mediated endeavors of help and development projects?
Yeah, the one group that comes to mind in terms of trying to figure out how can you invest, if the group is paying also a small fee. Not all groups do. I should qualify that not all groups require members to also pay a fee on top of participating in this group. Many of them are voluntary and there are no fees attached. But if there's a group that does, and a number of them do them in Haiti, and oftentimes the group will decide, once expenses and fees are covered, what does the group want to do? It's like I don't know if you're familiar with this idea of hometown associations. So people then will decide collectively, particularly if they're from a certain area, what needs to be done. And that could be an internal project. Maybe the group is engaged in milling and they need better machinery. It could be that they need a library. It could be some infrastructure for a school. But usually that's done at a very localized group level that I've witnessed. Whether banker ladies are moving at another level, no, I don't see that. Usually it's a group project, community focused, or partnerships, or could be individualized businesses that they're doing. The formalized aspect of ROSC is very different from remittances, right? So when they have memberships, I think you're speaking to the part where, you know, you can have a banker lady located in Kingston, Jamaica, but she has members located in different parts of the diaspora. Often they will wire monies. The sums are not so huge that they will cause alarm because of all this anti-terrorist activity. But there have been groups who've had issues, and particularly groups who are being profiled right now. So I have heard in certain Eritrean or Somali communities, even some Ethiopian, when they make transfers of a certain number, it either gets returned or confiscated, held, unless they can prove otherwise. So that's where, so that's why the discussion on to formalize or formalize doesn't have really great consensus among the people I talk to. Because there are people like Somalis or other Muslim, black Muslims, who feel that the current financial system is ignorant of what Muslims can and can't do with money. And they can't even participate because of the structure is exclusionary. So they would like some sort of Islamic or formalization of their system just so it's recognized. But other groups who participate in banking systems can carry money. I think they do this in remittances, right? They send goods in barrels or they pocket it and you walk this over. I mean, basically you smuggle monies in and authorities are not aware of that happening. Banker ladies, when they tend to do it from overseas, it's usually sending some sort of wire transfer that they're doing, but they're in small enough denominations that it doesn't cause worry that way. That's one aspect of how they're doing it. I hope I've answered your question. It's a good one. I'd like to think that through some more as well. So hopefully we can find some time to discuss it.